Okay, so now that we've talked about why climate change is so important and why we should talk about it, we're going to shift our attention to how we should talk about climate change. So there are some very important distinctions, and they've done a lot of research to show that there are some ways that are better to communicate these ideas of climate change than others. And so we're going to focus on those scientifically proven ways that are shown to be the most effective. So to illustrate my point here, first I'm showing an image, and I want you to think about, what do you see? Those lines there in red, what does that look like to you? Okay, so hopefully now you have an idea. And I'm using this exercise, which I have also participated in myself, to introduce this concept of framing. And framing is this idea that how you're interpreting information is dependent on the context. So if we look here, before we just had what was in the middle. If you also see before it and after it the letters A and C, your mind's going to fill in and assume that, oh, that must have been the letter B. But if we give it different context, different framing, if instead now here on the bottom we see that before that we have a 12, after we have a 13, then we think, oh, that in the middle must have been a 13, not a B. So this idea of framing is this concept of how you're presenting the information to help kind of nudge your audience towards what you want them to be thinking about. And in the context of climate change, we really want people to be thinking about solutions so we can be proactive and avoid this emotional spiral of thinking that climate change is awful and we're all doomed. We want to focus on productive strategies, and so framing is one way to help us do that. And as I said, framing is a really important tool for climate change communication. In particular, a lot of the material that I'm using for this module is from a group called the National Network for Ocean and Climate Change Interpretation. It's called NYOCI for short. And so I think that's another good way to illustrate this concept of framing. If you had never heard of this organization and I just said the word gnocchi to you, maybe if you're like me, you think of the food gnocchi, which I spent way too much time finding an appropriate picture, and now I'm really hungry and want some gnocchi. But this idea of framing, depending on how you're presenting that information, if I just say the word gnocchi, you might think of the food, but in reality, we're talking about this climate change interpretation network. And I also want to give credit to Dr. Rochelle Tanner, who is shown here, who is a part of this network, and she has provided a lot of the material that we're using for this module. So thank you very much to her. I could not have done this without her. And so if we think about the main goal of this network, their goal is to train trusted communicators in proven communication techniques to shift the national conversation about climate change so it's more productive and focused on solutions, as I said earlier. And so some of the objectives of this organization are to empower citizens. So hopefully by going through this module, which again is just a snapshot of everything that's available out there, but hopefully you can feel empowered as citizens. And you'll also learn fundamentals about climate and ocean change, and you'll learn about some compelling examples and solutions that you can then share with others. And again, we'll talk about specifically how are some of the best ways to share that information. And another place that a lot of our material came from is something called Frameworks Academy. So get it, frameworks, they're framing their ideas. And so there's actually a whole free course that you can take online. I can put that information on Canvas if anyone's interested. Again, we're just scratching the surface here, but just to acknowledge that the material that we're using was taken from somewhere else. And if we think about the main communication goal when we're talking about climate change with other people, especially people in the public, we want that information to stick, to take hold in other people's minds so they'll remember it even after they stop talking to us. This is kind of a side note, but this is also a term that's often used in teaching and learning. So making ideas stick. This is an excellent book on how to learn effectively. if you are interested, if you have ever taken my classes before, like BIO2, for instance, you've done a lot of the strategies in this book, maybe without even knowing, because I have used them. But when we're talking about communication of climate change, our goal is to make this information stick. We want people to remember what we've told them. And one of the best ways to do that is through using something called explanatory metaphors. And so in this case, what a metaphor is, it's a simple, concrete, and memorable comparison. And the reason why this is used is because it is able to quickly and effectively explain some topic that's either really complex or that's abstract. So something that if you aren't a scientist, for instance, maybe you've never heard of greenhouse gases or carbon dioxide emissions, and so it might be something that's really complex or abstract for you, and using metaphors is one way to make this more understandable and to make it stick better. And so what we'll do in the next two videos is talk about two particular metaphors, one of which is called the heat trapping blanket. So we talked about heat trapping a little bit, and then also one involving carbon dioxide. So in the next two videos, we'll go into each of those two metaphors in more depth.